There's a sound the sea makes on a quiet Cornish morning, a gentle, rhythmic sigh against the shingle. It's a sound I've known my whole life, here in this little fishing village of Palpero. It's a sound of permanence, of something that was here long before I was born and will be here long after I'm gone. For me, that sound has always been a comfort, a constant companion through a life that has been anything but constant. It whispers of tides that go out but always, always return. But some things, some people, they go out and the tide never brings them back. That's a lesson life teaches you the hard way, a lesson etched into the lines around my eyes and the quiet ache in my heart that never truly fades. My name is Margaret Thompson, and for the past 15 years, I've been a waitress at a little cafe overlooking the harbor, a place called the Salty Spoon. It's not a glamorous life, not by any stretch of the imagination. The tables are a bit wobbly, the paint is peeling from the sea spray, and the scent of fried bacon and strong tea clings to everything. But it's an honest life. It's my life. It wasn't the one I had planned, of course. Decades ago, I had a husband, a small cottage with a garden full of roses, and a son. My Daniel. He had hair the color of summer wheat and a laugh that could chase away the thickest coastal fog. He was my world, my everything. And then, one day, he was gone. A sickness came quietly, a thief in the night, and it took him from me. He was only 8. The years that followed are a blur of grief, a heavy blanket I thought I would never climb out from under. My husband, a good man but a man broken by the loss, drifted away from me, and eventually we parted, not with anger, but with a shared, silent sorrow that was too heavy for two people to carry together. So I found myself here at the Salty Spoon, pouring tea for tourists and listening to the fishermen's tales. It was a way to keep moving, a way to put one foot in front of the other when every part of my soul wanted to lie down and surrender. The cafe became my sanctuary. The routine was a balm. Wake up, walk the cobbled streets to the harbor, tie my apron, wipe down the tables, and smile. I learned to find small joys in the ordinary. The satisfaction of a perfectly brewed pot of tea. The grateful smile of a weary traveler. The way the morning sun would catch the water and make it glitter like a field of scattered diamonds. I thought my life was set, that this was the final chapter, a quiet epilogue of service and memory. I had no idea that the tide was about to bring in the most unexpected and difficult challenge of my entire existence. It happened on a Tuesday in late October. The tourist season was over, and a gray, persistent drizzle had settled over the village. The Salty Spoon was nearly empty, save for a couple of old fishermen nursing their mugs and talking in low rumbles. That's when the car pulled up. A car like I'd never seen in Palpero before. It was long, black, and so polished it seemed to repel the rain. A chauffeur in a dark suit got out and opened the rear door. Out stepped a man who was the complete opposite of our little town. He wore a tailored cashmere coat that probably cost more than my entire year's wages. His shoes were impossibly shiny, and his face was sharp, angular, and etched with a kind of weary authority. He looked like a man who was used to owning every room he walked into. But it wasn't him that held my attention. It was the small boy who followed him, clutching his hand. The boy was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, the same age my Daniel had been. He was exquisitely dressed in a miniature version of his father's expensive attire. But his clothes were the only vibrant thing about him. His face was pale, his shoulders were slumped, and his eyes, oh his eyes. They were the most desolate things I had ever seen. They were wide and blue, but utterly vacant, like 2 empty windows in a house where no one lived. They weren't looking at the harbor, or the boats, or the seagulls. They weren't looking at anything at all. They came inside, bringing a gust of cold, rain-scented air with them. The man, with a curt nod, chose the best table in the house, the one in the corner with the panoramic view of the harbor. I picked up my notepad, smoothed my apron, and walked over, preparing my usual welcoming smile. "Good morning," I said, my voice soft. "What can I get for you today?" The man didn't look at me. He was busy fussing with his son, trying to coax him into the chair. "Leo, sit down." "Sit, son. Do you want some juice?" "A cake." The boy, Leo, remained silent, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. He was a perfect, silent statue of a child. The man sighed, a sound of profound, frustrated exhaustion. He finally turned his gaze on me, and his eyes were as sharp and assessing as a hawk's. 2 teas. And a plate of whatever pastries you have. The best ones. His tone was clipped, dismissive. He was a man who expected immediate compliance. I nodded and went to prepare his order. As I sliced the lemon drizzle cake and arranged the scones on a plate, I couldn't help but watch them. The father kept trying to engage his son, his voice a low, urgent murmur. He'd point out the window, "Look, Leo, a boat. See the funny bird on the roof?" But the boy gave no sign that he heard a single word. He just sat there, lost in his own silent, isolated world. My heart constricted. I saw a ghost sitting at that table. The ghost of my own lost boy. The posture, the delicate shape of his neck, it was an echo of Daniel. I brought the tray over and set it down gently. "Here you are. Freshly baked this morning," I said, trying to add a little warmth to the cold silence at their table. The man, Mr. Blackwood, as I would later learn, just grunted. But as I placed the plate of cakes down, my hand brushed a little too close to Leo's glass of water. He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and his vacant eyes flickered towards me for a single, fleeting second. In that split second, I saw it. It wasn't emptiness. It was terror. A deep, bottomless well of fear. I instinctively softened my entire being. I didn't pull away. I kept my hand there for a moment and said, in the quietest voice I could manage, "It's all right, sweetheart. It's just me. My name is Margaret." The boy didn't respond, his gaze returning to the middle distance. But his father had seen it. He had seen the flicker. He watched me, his sharp eyes narrowing, a strange, calculating look dawning on his face. He watched as I moved away to tend to the other customers, his focus no longer on the harbor, but entirely on me, a simple waitress in a worn apron. They stayed for over an hour. The man drank his tea. The cakes remained untouched. The boy remained silent. When it was time to leave, the man walked over to the counter, pulling out a thick wallet. He placed a 50-pound note on the counter, far more than the bill. "Keep the change," he said, his voice low and intense. He paused, looking at me directly. I saw how he looked at you. It was a reaction. He doesn't do that. He hasn't for a very long time. I didn't know what to say. "He's a lovely boy," was all I could manage. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt utterly out of place in my humble cafe. "He doesn't speak," he said, the words heavy with a pain that all his money couldn't cure. "Not a word. For a year. I've had him to the best doctors, therapists, specialists in London, in Switzerland. Nothing. No one can reach him." He stared at me, and I saw a desperation in his eyes that I recognized. It was the desperation of a parent willing to do anything, to bargain with the devil himself, to save their child. And then he said the words that would turn my quiet, predictable life completely upside down. He gestured with his head towards the cafe, towards my worn-out, beloved salty spoon. "Make my son speak," he said, his voice a strange mix of a command and a plea. "Make him say just one word, and I'll buy you this restaurant. I'll buy the whole building. It will be yours, free and clear." I stood there, speechless, the 50-pound note feeling like a burning coal on the counter. The seaside outside the window, a timeless, steady rhythm. But inside my chest, my heart was hammering a frantic, chaotic beat. A billionaire was standing in my cafe, offering me a fortune, a new life, in exchange for a miracle. And all I could see was the ghost of my own son, sitting silently in the eyes of a terrified little boy. My first thought wasn't about the money, or the restaurant, or a life of ease. My first thought was a wave of indignation. How dare he? How dare he think that a child's soul was a commodity to be bought and sold? How dare he try to purchase a human connection, to put a price tag on a miracle? I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. "Sir," I began, my voice colder than I intended, "my name is Margaret. And a child's voice is not for sale. Not for this restaurant. Not for all the money in the world." Mr. Blackwood was taken aback. I could tell he wasn't used to being refused. He was a man who wrote checks and solved problems. But I wasn't a problem to be solved, and Leo certainly wasn't a business transaction. He opened his mouth to argue, to raise the offer, I'm sure, but I held up a hand. That is my answer regarding your offer, I said, choosing my words carefully. However, I continued, my gaze drifting back to the small, silent boy who was now standing by the door, a fragile figure against the gray light. I am not a miracle worker. I'm a waitress. But I was also a mother. And if you would like to bring your son back here, I will talk to him. I will sit with him. I won't do it for a reward. I'll do it because no child should have to live inside a silence that deep. A complex array of emotions passed over the billionaire's face. Surprise, frustration, a flicker of something that might have been respect, and finally, a weary, beaten-down acceptance. He had tried everything his wealth could offer. Now, here was something different. Something that had no price. He nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. We will be back. Tomorrow. Same time. And with that, he turned, took his son's unresponsive hand, and led him out into the rain, leaving me standing behind the counter of the Salty Spoon, my heart aching with a mixture of old grief and a terrifying, unfamiliar new hope. I had no idea what I was doing, no plan, no expertise. All I had was a memory of a boy with wheat-colored hair and a sudden, fierce, and perhaps foolish determination to reach another who was lost in the fog. The tide had brought something strange and challenging to my shore, and I had a feeling my quiet life was well and truly over. The next day, true to his word, Mr. Blackwood and Leo returned. The black car was more of a spectacle this time. A few of the locals paused their morning walks to stare at the gleaming machine parked incongruously next to weathered fishing boats. Inside the Salty Spoon, an unspoken tension filled the air. I had spent the night wrestling with my decision, tossing and turning as the sound of the waves seemed to mock my audacity. What on earth did I think I could do? I wasn't a doctor. I was a woman who knew how to make a perfect custard and how to listen to the lonely. Perhaps, I thought, that was all I had to offer. Listening. When they sat at the same corner table, I approached not with a notepad, but with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, topped with a mountain of whipped cream and a dusting of cocoa. I placed one in front of Leo and one in front of his father. Mr. Blackwood looked at me, a question in his eyes. I didn't order these. I know, I replied softly, my gaze on Leo. But it's a damp, chilly morning. I thought a bit of warmth might be nice. My Daniel, he used to say that a good hot chocolate could fix almost anything. I mentioned my son's name deliberately. It was a risk, bearing a piece of my own fragile heart, but I felt it was the only honest place to start. I wasn't a professional performing a service. I was a person, Margaret, who understood loss. Leo's eyes, those empty pools, didn't change. He didn't reach for the mug. Mr. Blackwood, however, looked at me with a new kind of attention. The arrogance was still there, but it was tempered with a sliver of curiosity. He was observing me, trying to figure out my methods, as if I were a puzzle he needed to solve. I didn't press. I pulled a chair from a nearby table and, after a hesitant glance at Mr. Blackwood, who gave a minute nod of permission, I sat down. Not too close, just at the edge of their space. I didn't look at Leo directly. Instead, I looked out the window at the harbor. See that boat there? I said, my voice conversational, as if I were talking to an old friend. The green one with the name the Sea Serpent? Old man Hemlock owns that. He's been fishing these waters since he was a boy, younger even than you. He told me once that when he was a lad, he saw a great big basking shark right out there in the bay. Said it was as big as his boat, with a mouth wide enough to swallow a postbox. He wasn't scared, though. He said it was the most beautiful, peaceful thing he'd ever seen. I just kept talking. I told stories of the village, of the quirky characters, of the smuggling tunnels that were rumored to exist beneath our feet. I spoke of the changing seasons, how the sea turned from a gentle blue in summer to a fearsome, churning gray in winter. I didn't ask Leo any questions. I didn't demand any response. I just filled the silence with my voice, with the tapestry of a life lived in this small corner of the world. I was weaving a blanket of words, hoping it might offer a little warmth against the cold that enveloped him. For an hour, I talked. Mr. Blackwood sat rigidly, his untouched hot chocolate going cold. Leo just stared. Not once did he move. Not once did he give any sign he was listening. When the time was up, Mr. Blackwood stood, paid for the drinks he hadn't ordered, and left. There were no pronouncements, no renewed offers. Just a quiet, "We'll be back tomorrow." This became our new routine. Every morning, like clockwork, the black car would arrive. The billionaire and his silent son would take their corner table. I would bring them something, a warm scone with jam and cream, a slice of freshly baked apple pie, a glass of milk. And then I would sit and I would talk. I started to run out of stories about the village, so I began to talk about myself. I told him about growing up, about learning to swim in the cold sea, about the first time I baked a cake with my mother, getting more flour on myself than in the bowl. And tentatively, painfully, I began to talk more about Daniel. Daniel loved to draw, I said one morning, my voice catching slightly. I cleared my throat and continued. He wasn't very good at it, mind you. His people were all stick figures with wobbly heads. But he loved it. He would draw the boats, the gulls, the family dog. He had a big book of paper, and he filled every single page. He said it was his way of catching the world and keeping it safe. As I spoke those words, I saw it. The tiniest of movements. Leo's fingers, which were resting limply on the table, twitched. It was nothing. A neurological flicker. But to me, it was a thunderclap. He had heard me. The word draw had breached the wall. The next day, I came to the table not with food, but with a brand new sketchbook and a small box of colored pencils. I placed them on the table, right next to his hand. "I was in the shop this morning," I said casually, looking out the window again, and I saw these. And it made me think of Daniel. I thought, well, maybe someone else would like to catch the world and keep it safe. I didn't say any more. I just sat in silence with them. The quiet felt different this time. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an expectant hush. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Mr. Blackwood was holding his breath. I could see the tension in his jaw. Then, with a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, Leo's hand crept across the table. His small fingers brushed against the cover of the sketchbook. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand on it. It was the first voluntary, purposeful thing I had seen him do. My heart soared. I felt a rush of emotion so strong it made me dizzy. It wasn't triumph. It was a profound, aching tenderness. This small, broken boy was taking a step, a minuscule step, out of his darkness. For the rest of the week, the sketchbook and pencils sat on the table. Each day, Leo would place his hand on it. On Friday, he finally picked it up. He held it in his lap, his fingers tracing the outline of the cover. He didn't open it, but he was holding it. He was connecting with it. Mr. Blackwood was becoming a different man before my eyes. The impatient, commanding tycoon was slowly being replaced by a father, watching his son with a desperate, painful hope. One afternoon, after Leo and his chauffeur had gone for a walk along the cliffs, Mr. Blackwood stayed behind. "What you're doing? The patience," he said, his voice husky. "I don't have it. I want to fix it. I want to shake him and demand he tell me what's wrong. I've tried everything. I've yelled. I've begged. I've promised him anything in the world." "You can't command grief to leave, Mr. Blackwood," I said softly. "It's not an employee you can fire. It's a visitor. And it only leaves when it has been properly acknowledged. Sometimes it never leaves. It just learns to live with you." He looked down at his expensive shoes, looking for the first time like he was truly lost. "His mother," he began, his voice cracking. "My wife, Amelia. There was a car accident. A year ago. It was instant for her. Leo was in the back seat. He saw everything. He was pulled from the wreckage, physically unharmed. But he hasn't said a word since that day. The doctors call it selective mutism, brought on by severe trauma. They say he has locked the memory away and his voice with it. The story settled in the room, heavy and suffocating. It was worse than I had imagined. My own loss had been a slow, creeping sickness. His was a sudden, violent tearing. I looked at this man, this billionaire, and I didn't see a captain of industry. I saw a fellow traveler in the land of sorrow. A heartbroken husband, a terrified father. He doesn't just need to find his voice, Mr. Blackwood, I told him, my own voice thick with unshed tears. He needs to know that it's safe to feel what he feels. That it's all right to be sad. That it's all right to be angry. That the world didn't end, even if it feels like it did. The following Monday was a bright, windswept day. The sea was a brilliant, shimmering blue. When they came in, Leo was clutching his sketchbook. I brought them their drinks, and then, without a word, Leo opened the book. He picked up a blue pencil and started to draw. He drew a wavy line. And then another. He filled the whole page with blue, wavy lines. The sea. On the next page, he used a gray pencil. Jagged, angry scribbles. A storm. For weeks, this was his language. He drew the sea in all its moods, calm, choppy, furious. He drew the sky, bright and clear, or heavy with dark, menacing clouds. He was drawing his inner world. One day, he drew a boat. A small, simple boat, bobbing on a vast, empty blue page. It looked so lonely, so adrift. My heart ached looking at it. That's a lovely boat, Leo, I said gently. It looks a bit lonely out there, though, doesn't it? Every boat needs a harbor. I took a brown pencil from the box and, on the edge of his vast sea, I drew a small, simple outline of a quay with a little building on it. The Salty Spoon. I drew a little stick figure standing on the quay. I gave her an apron. Leo looked at my drawing, then back at his lonely boat. He picked up the blue pencil again and slowly, hesitantly, he drew a line from the boat, connecting it to the harbor I had drawn for him. Tears pricked my eyes. I didn't dare wipe them away. Mr. Blackwood, sitting opposite, made a small, choked sound. It was a conversation. We were having a conversation, without a single word being spoken. The breakthrough, when it came, was not grand or cinematic. It was as small and fragile as Leo himself. A few days later, he was drawing again. He was working on a detailed picture of a seagull perched on a post. He was concentrating so hard. His tongue was sticking out of the corner of his mouth, a sight so childlike and normal it made my chest tighten. A sudden gust of wind rattled the old window frame of the cafe, making a loud bang. Leo jumped, his whole body jolting. The pencil flew from his hand, and the sketchbook tumbled from the table, landing face down on the floor. His face crumpled. The vacant look was gone, replaced by one of pure, absolute panic. His breathing became shallow, his eyes wide with a familiar terror. He was back in the car. He was back in that moment. I didn't think. I just reacted. I knelt down beside him, ignoring Mr. Blackwood, who had half risen from his chair. I didn't touch Leo. I just put myself in his line of sight. It's all right, Leo, I said, my voice as calm and steady as I could make it. It's all right. It was just the wind. We're safe. You're here in the cafe. With me. With Margaret. We're safe. I kept repeating it like a mantra. We're safe. His eyes were darting around, lost. He looked at the fallen sketchbook, a symbol of his one safe outlet, now lying on the floor. A single tear tracked its way down his pale cheek. And then his lips, which had been silent for a year, parted. A sound came out. A tiny, croaking whisper. It was barely audible, just a puff of air. Gone, he whispered. The word hung in the air of the Salty Spoon. Gone. It was a word of utter despair. The sketchbook was gone. The pencil was gone. His mother was gone. His voice was gone. It was the one word that encompassed his entire tragedy. Mr. Blackwood sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. I could see his shoulders shaking. I didn't look at him. My entire world was focused on the small boy in front of me. I smiled, a real, watery, tremulous smile. No, sweetheart, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I reached down and picked up the sketchbook. It's not gone. See? It's right here. It just fell. Everything is right here. It's safe. I handed it back to him. He took it, his small hands trembling. He looked from the book to me, his eyes finally, truly seeing me. And in their blue depths I saw a flicker. Not of terror. Not of emptiness. But of a dawning, fragile, tentative trust. He had spoken his pain, and the world hadn't ended. Someone had been there to hear him. The silence was broken. The word gone was not a finish line. It was a doorway. A creaky, rusted, barely opened doorway into the world Leo had locked himself out of. In the days that followed, it was as if that single word had unplugged a dam. Not with a flood, but with a slow, hesitant trickle. He didn't start speaking in sentences. It was just words at first. Whispers, prompted by his drawings. He would draw a boat and look at me, and I would say, "That's a beautiful boat, Leo." And he might whisper, "Boat." He drew a seagull, and after a long silence, he would breathe the word, "bird." Each word was a victory. Each syllable was a miracle that we celebrated not with cheers, but with quiet smiles and a shared understanding. Mr. Blackwood, whose name I now knew was Alistair, had transformed. The tycoon was gone, replaced by a father who hung on his son's every whisper. He stopped looking at his watch. He stopped taking calls on his phone. He was simply present, learning a new language of patience that I had been practicing for years out of necessity. He started talking to me, really talking, during the moments when Leo was absorbed in his drawing. He told me about Amelia, his wife. He didn't speak of her as a possession or an accessory to his life, but as his partner, his best friend. He spoke of her laugh, her love for gardening, her terrible singing voice. He was unpacking his own grief, just as Leo was unpacking his through his drawings. I thought I had to be strong for him, Alistair confessed one afternoon, his voice low. I thought if I showed any weakness, he would crumble. So I bottled it all up. I focused on fixing him. I never just sat with him in the sadness. I don't know how. No one does, at first, I replied, topping up his tea. Grief doesn't come with an instruction manual. You just have to learn to hold it, to make space for it. For yourself and for him. He needs to see that you're sad, too. That you both miss her. That it's a shared sadness, not one he has to carry all by himself. The next morning, something shifted. Alistair brought in a small, framed photograph and placed it on the table. It was a picture of a smiling, vibrant woman with kind eyes. Amelia. Leo, who had been about to start drawing, froze. He stared at the photograph. Alistair knelt beside him, his movements no longer sharp and efficient, but slow and gentle. That's your mom, Alistair said, his voice thick. That's my Amelia. I miss her, Leo. I miss her so much, every single day. Tears were streaming down the billionaire's face. He wasn't hiding them. He was letting his son see his pain, his vulnerability. Leo looked from the photograph to his father's weeping face. He reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched a tear on his father's cheek. Then he looked at the photo again. "Mum," he whispered. The word was clearer this time, more solid. He then looked at Alistair. "Dad's sad." It was his first sentence. A simple, 3-word observation. Dad. Sad. But it was a universe of understanding. Alistair let out a sob, a sound of pure relief and heartbreak, and he wrapped his arms around his son. For the first time, Leo didn't stiffen. He leaned into the embrace, burying his face in his father's expensive coat. I turned away, giving them their moment, my own eyes blurred with tears as I pretended to wipe down the counter. In the quiet grief of a father and son, I saw the healing of a wound I thought was fatal. From that day on, the words came more easily. Leo started talking about his drawings. Blue sea, big ship, funny bird eat chip. He started asking questions. Why sky gray? Where boats go? His world, which had been silent and internal, was starting to spill out. He began to talk to me too. He would show me his drawings and wait for my reaction. One day, he drew a stick figure with a wobbly head and a dress. He pointed to it. Margaret, he said. Then he drew another stick figure next to it, a much smaller one. Leo, he declared. He then took a yellow pencil, the color of sunshine, and drew a circle around both of us. My heart felt like it would burst. Alistair and Leo stayed in Palpero for another month. They rented a cottage down the lane from me, and our morning sessions at the cafe became a part of a larger, more normal routine. Sometimes, after the cafe closed, the 3 of us would walk along the beach, Leo running ahead to chase the waves, his laughter, when it came, a sound more precious than any jewel. He was still a quiet, pensive boy, but the emptiness in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by curiosity, by light, by life. He was a child again. The day before they were due to leave, Alistair asked me to stay behind after we closed. The salty spoon was quiet, the chairs stacked on the tables, the setting sun casting long, golden shafts of light through the windows. "Margaret," he began, his voice formal but warm. "I find myself in your debt. A debt that no amount of money could ever possibly repay." "There is no debt, Alistair," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. Seeing Leo smile, hearing him talk, that's the only payment I would ever want. "I know," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "You made that very clear from the beginning, which is why my original, clumsy offer is off the table." He paused, taking a deep breath. "However, I made a promise to myself that if you helped my son, I would find a way to honor you. Not to pay you, Margaret. To thank you." He slid a thick folder across the counter. I looked at it, then back at him warily. "I'm not a charity case, Alistair," I said softly. "I know you're not," he replied. "Please, just look." I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, deeds, and architectural plans. My eyes widened. He had bought the building. Not just the cafe, but the entire 3-story property it was housed in. "Alistair, I told you." "Let me finish," he insisted. "The salty spoon is, forgive me, falling apart. Your boss was happy to sell. This place has been your sanctuary, and you have turned it into a sanctuary for my son. I don't want to just give it to you. That would feel transactional, and what we have shared is anything but." He tapped the architectural plans. "I want to form a partnership. We will renovate this place, from top to bottom. New kitchen, new furniture, we'll fix the leaky roof and restore the flats upstairs. It will still be the salty spoon, but it will be the best version of it. And I want you to run it. Not as a waitress, but as the managing owner. You'll have a salary that reflects that and a percentage of the profits. The rest of the profits, and this was my idea, will go into a new charitable foundation we're establishing." He pushed another document towards me. It was the charter for a nonprofit organization, the Amelia Blackwood Foundation for Children's Healing. Its mission was to provide art therapy and grief counseling to children who had experienced trauma. "It will be based here," Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. "In the rooms upstairs. We'll fund it, of course. But it will be headquartered here, in the place where my son found his way back. It will be Amelia's legacy. And Leo's. And yours." I was speechless. I sank onto a stool, staring at the papers. It wasn't a crass payment. It was a proposal. A continuation. A way to take the small, quiet miracle that had happened in this little cafe and turn it into a beacon of hope for others. It was a way to honor Amelia. And in a way I could never have expected, it was a way to honor my Daniel too. The love I still had for him, the lessons his short life had taught me, would now ripple outwards, touching countless other children. I don't know what to say," I stammered. "Say yes, Margaret," Alistair said, his voice gentle. "Say you'll be my partner in this. Help me do some good with all this money I never knew what to do with." Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of a future I never dared to dream of. I looked around at my worn, beloved cafe, and I saw not peeling paint and wobbly tables, but the foundation of something beautiful. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I'll be your partner." The next day, they left. Leo ran to me before he got in the car and gave me a fierce hug. "Bye, Margaret," he said, his voice clear and bright. "We'll come back soon. I'll draw you a picture of the city." "I'd love that, sweetheart," I said, hugging him back, breathing in the scent of his clean hair. I stood on the pavement and watched the big black car drive away, navigating the narrow streets of Palpero until it disappeared. The fishermen nodded to me as they passed. The seagulls cried overhead. The sea sighed its eternal, rhythmic sigh against the shingle. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. My life wasn't a quiet epilogue anymore. It was a new chapter, one I never could have written for myself. The Salty Spoon closed for renovations a month later, and for 6 months it was transformed. It reopened, bright and beautiful, but with all of its old warmth and character intact. The tables were new, but they were made of solid, local oak. The kitchen was state-of-the-art. And upstairs, the Amelia Blackwood Foundation was born. I am no longer a waitress. I am a business owner, a partner, a part of a legacy. But I still wear my apron. I still pour the tea. I still listen to the stories of the lonely and the weary. Because that is who I am. That is Margaret. Alistair and Leo visit often. Leo is a chatterbox now, a bright, funny, wonderfully ordinary boy. He loves to come and help in the kitchen, and his drawings cover the walls of my new office. The emptiness in his eyes is a distant memory. Sometimes, when the cafe is quiet, I stand by the window and look out at the harbor. I think of my Daniel, my boy with the wheat-colored hair. The ache of his absence is still there. It will always be there. It's the price of a great love. But it's no longer a crippling weight. It's a part of me, a quiet hum beneath the surface. And I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that he would be proud. His memory, my love for him, helped to save another little boy. The tide goes out, but it always comes back in. It took my son, and for so long, I thought it had taken my life with him. But then, it brought me another boy, a broken father, and an unexpected purpose. It taught me that even after the greatest of losses, a life can be rebuilt. Not the same as it was before, but something new. Something different. Something meaningful. And for that, I am eternally, profoundly grateful. There's a sound that belongs only to the loneliest hours of a Nova Scotia morning, just before the sun has the courage to burn through the mist. It's the deep, mournful call of the foghorn out on the point. For 30 years, I've heard that sound from my little bedroom window here in Lunenburg. For the first 10, it was a lullaby, a comforting moan that meant my husband, Arthur, was safe in our bed beside me. For the last 20, it's been a companion in solitude, a sound that understands the hollow ache of an empty space next to you in the sheets. Some people hear a warning in that sound. I hear a conversation. It's the sound of the sea asking a question, and the land sighing back an answer. It's a reminder that even in the thickest fog, where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, something is still out there, calling, guiding, keeping watch. I suppose I've spent the better part of my life trying to be that for others, in my own small way. A quiet light in the fog. My name is Edna Robinson. I'm 68 years old, and most days, you can find me at the Harbor Light, a little diner that clings to the wharf like a barnacle to a ship's hull. I've been pouring coffee and serving up plates of fish and chips there since Arthur passed. He was a fisherman, like his father before him. A good man, with hands as rough as rope and a heart as vast and kind as the ocean he worked. He was lost in a storm, a sudden squall that came out of nowhere. One day he was kissing me goodbye at the door, the scent of salt and morning dew on his jacket, and the next, he was a memory. A photograph on the mantelpiece. An ache in my soul that the foghorn seemed to understand better than any person ever could. The diner saved me. The routine of it. Wiping down the red vinyl booths, the clatter of cutlery, the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon, the predictable grumbles of the old fishermen about the price of lobster. It was a rhythm, a steady beat that kept my own heart from stopping altogether. My life had become small, you see. After losing Arthur, and after our only daughter, Lily, moved halfway across the country to build her own life, my world had shrunk to the size of this town, to the four walls of this diner. I wasn't unhappy. I was settled. I had my memories, my small rituals, and the constant, reassuring presence of the sea. I believed my story was already written, that I was simply living out the final, quiet pages. I had no idea that a sleek black car was about to pull up and tear the whole book wide open. It happened on a Tuesday in that bleak part of autumn when the vibrant colors have faded and winter is still a cold promise on the wind. The fog was so thick that day it felt like the whole world had been wrapped in damp cotton. The harbor light was warm and steamy inside, a cozy refuge. I was refilling the sugar shakers when the car appeared out of the mist, silent as a shark. It was utterly alien to our town of dented pickup trucks and sensible sedans. Long, black, and polished to a mirror shine, it seemed to drink the light around it. A man in a crisp, dark suit emerged from the driver's side and opened the back door. The man who stepped out was like the car he arrived in, sharp, expensive, and completely out of place. He wore a gray wool coat that probably cost more than my little house, and his face was a mask of strained patience and deep, weary frustration. He looked like a man who was used to bending the world to his will and was exhausted by its refusal to comply. But it wasn't him that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the little boy he led by the hand. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. He was dressed in a perfect, miniature version of his father's costly attire, a tiny gentleman in a cashmere sweater. But the clothes were a costume on a ghost. His face was pale and still, and his eyes were the most vacant things I had ever seen. They were a beautiful shade of hazel, but they held no light, no curiosity, no life. They were like the windows of an abandoned house, staring out at a world he was no longer a part of. He walked with a stillness that was unnatural for a child, his small hand lost in his father's grip. They came in, bringing a swirl of fog and the damp chill of the outside with them. The man swept his gaze over the humble diner with a barely concealed air of disdain, before choosing the booth in the far corner, the one with the best view of the misty harbor. I watched them for a moment from behind the counter, my heart giving a strange, painful lurch. There was something in the boy's stillness, in his utter disconnection, that felt unnervingly familiar. It was the same terrible quiet that had settled in my own house after Arthur was gone, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Taking a breath, I smoothed down my apron, grabbed a menu, and walked over. I tried to summon my best welcoming smile, the one I reserved for the summer tourists. "Good morning," I said, my voice softer than usual. "Welcome to the Harbor Light. What can I get for you folks today?" The man didn't even look at me. He was trying to settle the boy into the booth. "Thomas, sit. Please, just sit down. Look, there are boats. Do you see the boats?" The boy, Thomas, gave no response. He allowed himself to be moved onto the vinyl seat, but his body remained rigid, his eyes fixed on the swirling gray outside the window, seeing nothing. The man let out a sigh, a sound frayed with a desperation that was almost palpable. He finally turned his gaze to me, and his eyes were sharp and impatient. "Coffee. Black. And whatever you have for a child. A juice box. A muffin. I don't care." His words were clipped, dismissive. He was a man accustomed to efficiency, and this entire situation was anything but. I nodded, my professional smile feeling brittle on my lips. "Of course." The blueberry muffins were just baked this morning. I went to the counter, my hands moving with practiced ease as I poured the coffee and placed a muffin and a carton of apple juice on a plate. But my mind was at that corner table. I watched the father lean in, his voice a low, urgent murmur, trying to break through the wall of silence that surrounded his son. He pointed at the gulls on the pier, at the lobster boats bobbing in the harbor. And the boy just sat there, a perfect, porcelain doll of a child, lost in a world of his own. An ache, old and deep, bloomed in my chest. It was the ache for my own Lily, not lost, but so far away. It was the ache of a mother's heart seeing a child in pain. I brought the order to the table, setting it down with a gentle clink. "Here we are," I said, trying to inject a little warmth into the cold bubble they occupied. "Be careful, the coffee is hot." The man grunted in acknowledgement, already reaching for the cup. But as I placed the muffin in front of Thomas, I noticed his little hands resting on the table. They were pale and still, and they looked so cold. On instinct, the same instinct that had made me check Lily's mittens 1,000 times, I reached out and gently touched his fingers. "Your hands are like ice, sweetheart," I murmured, my voice dropping. "It's much warmer in here, isn't it?" Thomas flinched at my touch, a violent, full-body shudder. His head snapped around, and for one terrifying, breathtaking second, his vacant eyes focused on my face. It wasn't a look of recognition or curiosity. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. A wild, trapped animal looking at the hand that had touched its cage. And then, just as quickly, the light vanished, and his gaze slid away, back to the impenetrable fog outside. I drew my hand back as if I'd been burned. But the father had seen it. His own eyes, sharp as a hawk's, were locked on my face. He had seen the flicker of reaction, the momentary breach in the wall. A strange, calculating expression began to form on his face, erasing the weary frustration. He watched me as I retreated to the counter, his stare so intense it felt like a physical touch. He was no longer looking at the harbor or his coffee. He was looking at me, an ordinary, aging waitress in a small-town diner. They stayed for nearly 2 hours. The man nursed his coffee. The muffin and juice were left untouched. The boy never moved. When they finally got up to leave, the man came to the register, pulling out a wallet that was thicker than my old recipe book. He tossed 2 $100 bills onto the counter. The bill was less than $10. "For your trouble," he said, his voice low and intense. He didn't look at the money. He looked at me. He reacted to you. When you touched him. He hasn't done that with anyone. Not the doctors, not the therapists. No one. I was flustered, unsure of what to say. "He's just a little boy," I managed, my hands twisting in my apron. He seemed cold. The man leaned forward, his expensive cologne filling the air, a scent of money and power that was so foreign in my world of salt and coffee grounds. "He doesn't speak," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet diner. Not a word. For 6 months. I have taken him to the best child psychiatrists in Toronto and Boston. They have theories. They have diagnoses. They have no answers. No one can get through to him. He stared at me, and in his eyes, I saw something I recognized all too well. It was the desperate, wild bargaining of a person who has lost everything that matters. It was the look I had seen in my own mirror in the months after Arthur's boat went down. It was the look of someone willing to trade anything, promise anything, for a sliver of hope. And then he spoke the words that would derail the quiet, predictable train of my life. He looked around my humble, worn-out diner, at the cracked vinyl, the faded photographs of fishing boats on the wall, the humming pie fridge. "Make my son speak," he said, his voice a strange, raw blend of a command and a desperate plea. "Get him to say one word. Just one. And I will buy you this restaurant. The whole building. I will sign the deed over to you free and clear. It will be yours." I stood there frozen, the 2 crisp bills on the counter feeling like an insult. The foghorn moaned its lonely call outside, a sound of deep, unending sorrow. Inside my chest, my heart was hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm. A man whose wealth I couldn't even comprehend was standing in my diner, offering me a fortune, offering me a kingdom, in exchange for a child's voice. And all I could see was the raw terror in that little boy's eyes. All I could feel was the echo of my own profound loss, a grief I had learned to live with, a grief this man was clearly drowning in. My first coherent thought was a surge of anger, hot and protective. How dare he? How dare he think a child's soul was a line item on a budget? How dare he try to purchase a human connection as if it were a stock or a piece of real estate? The audacity of it, the cold, transactional nature of his desperation, offended something deep within me. "Sir," I said, and my voice came out steadier and colder than I expected. "My name is Edna, and I am not a miracle worker. More importantly, a child's pain is not a commodity to be traded. His voice is not for sale. Not for this diner, not for all of Lunenburg." The man, Mr. Croft, as I would come to know him, was visibly stunned. He was clearly a man who did not hear the word no very often. His jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth, probably to double the offer, to name a figure he was sure I couldn't refuse. But I held up my hand, a gesture of finality I hadn't used since telling off rowdy teenagers decades ago. "That is my final word on your business proposition," I said, putting a slight emphasis on the last 2 words. I took a breath, my anger softening as my gaze drifted to the small, silent figure of Thomas, who was waiting patiently by the door, a tiny, lost soul in the gray light. "However," I continued, my voice losing its hard edge, "I was a mother for a long time. My own daughter is grown now, but the instincts, they don't fade. I will not work for your money. But if you wish to bring your son back here tomorrow, I will sit with him. I will talk to him. I have no special skills, Mr. Croft. All I have is time, and I will give him some of mine freely. I'll do it because I remember what it feels like to be lost in the fog, and no child should have to navigate that alone." A storm of emotions crossed the billionaire's handsome, tired face. Annoyance, disbelief, a flicker of something that looked like respect, and finally, a deep, bone-deep weariness that seemed to make him slump inside his expensive coat. He had thrown all the resources of his vast empire at this problem, and nothing had worked. Now here was an offer of something else entirely. Something that couldn't be bought. He gave a short, sharp nod. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. With that, he turned, strode to the door, and took his son's unresisting hand. He led him out into the thick, swirling mist, and the black car swallowed them up and disappeared as silently as it had arrived. I was left alone in the quiet diner, with $200 on my counter and the weight of a promise I had no idea how to keep. The foghorn called out again, its mournful voice seeming to ask a question I had no answer for. My quiet, predictable life, the life I had so carefully constructed from the wreckage of my past, was over. I had stepped off my safe, solid pier and into a small boat, heading out into a fog of my own. The following morning, I woke before the foghorn sounded its first call. An anxious energy hummed beneath my skin, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. What had I done? What foolish pride had made me, a simple diner waitress, think I could succeed where a legion of expensive specialists had failed? I stood in my small kitchen, nursing a cup of tea, and looked at the photograph on my mantelpiece. It was Arthur and a 5-year-old Lily, both of them beaming, their faces lit with summer sunshine. Lily was holding up a string of shells she had found on the beach. A sudden, vivid memory washed over me. The feeling of her small, sandy hand in mine, her endless, chattering questions about every single shell, every piece of seaweed, every wave that washed over her toes. She had never been a quiet child. That was it, I realized. That was the only tool I had. I couldn't fix Thomas. I wasn't a mechanic. But I could offer him what Lily had always had from me, a safe space to simply be. A presence that asked for nothing in return. At 10 o'clock, precisely, the black car materialized from the fog again. Mr. Croft, Julian, he'd told me to call him, though the name felt foreign on my tongue, and Thomas came in. The diner was a little busier today, with a few fishermen nursing their coffees. They all stopped talking and stared as the billionaire and his silent son made their way to the corner booth. I could feel the curiosity in the air, thick as the fog outside. Ignoring the stares, I walked over, not with a notepad this time, but with a small, worn wooden box. I placed it on the center of the table. Julian looked at it, then at me, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. "I didn't order anything," he said, his voice still clipped. "I know," I replied, keeping my own voice low and calm. I didn't look at him. I looked at the box. I was cleaning out a closet this morning, and I found this. It belonged to my daughter, Lily, when she was about Thomas's age. She used to call it her treasure box. I didn't wait for permission. I gently lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a collection of a child's treasures. Smooth, gray stones from the beach. A few seagull feathers. A cracked robin's egg, impossibly blue. A sand dollar. And dozens of small, colorful seashells. I didn't say anything to Thomas. I didn't prompt him or ask him to look. I simply took out a large, pearlescent scallop shell and held it in my own palm. I ran my thumb over its ribbed surface, feeling the familiar texture. Lily used to think these were mermaids' fans, I said, my voice soft and conversational, as if I were talking to myself. She would hold them up to her ear and insist she could hear them singing. Arthur, my husband, he would tell her it was just the sound of the sea, trapped inside. But she preferred to believe in the mermaids. I kept talking, my eyes on the shell in my hand. I told them about the time Lily had tried to build a sandcastle big enough for a mermaid to live in, and how an unexpected wave had washed it all away, and how she had cried, and how Arthur had held her and told her that the sea sometimes takes things, but it always gives back in other ways. I spoke of Arthur's boat, the Lily May, named for our daughter, and how he had painted a mermaid on the bow for her. I was unspooling my own life, my own joys and sorrows, and laying them gently on the table between us. Julian sat ramrod straight, a statue of tense observation. He was watching for a reaction, a twitch, a sign. He was still thinking like a scientist in a lab. But Thomas was just sitting there. His eyes were still distant, but his head was angled slightly towards the box of shells. He wasn't looking at it, not directly, but his attention, which had been fixed on the fog, had shifted. I talked for nearly an hour. When I finally fell silent, the only sound was the gentle hum of the pie fridge and the low murmur of the fisherman at the counter. Nothing had happened. The boy hadn't moved. The shells remained untouched. Julian's face was a mask of disappointment. "I think we're done for today," he said, his voice flat. He stood up, preparing to leave. "Wait," I said, a sudden impulse making me speak. "Leave the box. Just for today. Let the treasures have a little visit." He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. He paid for a coffee he hadn't drunk, and they left, the little bell over the diner door giving a sad, tinny jingle. The next day, they returned. And the day after that. This became our strange, new ritual. The billionaire and his silent son would arrive at 10. They would sit in the corner booth. I would bring them hot chocolate or a glass of milk. And I would talk. The box of shells remained on the table, an open invitation. I told them stories about the town, about the Great Fire of 1920, about the ghost that is said to haunt the old opera house. I told them about my mother's recipe for blueberry grunt and how she taught me to make it. I spoke of the changing seasons in Lunenburg, the riot of lupins in June, the biting winds of January that could freeze the harbor solid. I was painting a world for him with my words, a world outside the gray fog of his trauma. And I kept talking about Lily. I told him how she learned to ride her bicycle on this very wharf, and how she fell and scraped her knee, and how I had kissed it better. I told him about the funny, off-key songs she would make up. I was offering up my most precious memories, pieces of my own heart, hoping that one of them might be a key that fit the lock of his silence. It was on the 4th day that something changed. I was telling a story about how Lily used to love to paint. We didn't have much money, so we couldn't afford proper canvases. She would paint on anything she could find, flat rocks, pieces of driftwood, and especially the big, smooth clam shells we found on the beach. She had a little set of watercolor paints, I was saying, looking out the window as if lost in the memory. She loved the color blue most of all. She said it was the color of the sea and the color of sad songs, all at once. As I spoke the word blue, I saw his hand, the one resting near the treasure box, make a tiny, spasming movement. His fingers curled, just for a second, then relaxed. It was almost nothing. Julian, who was watching his son with an unnerving intensity, didn't seem to notice. But I did. My heart gave a hopeful leap. He was there. Somewhere inside that silent fortress, he was listening. The next morning, before they arrived, I went to the town's little general store. I bought a small, cheap set of watercolor paints and a couple of fine-tipped brushes. When Julian and Thomas arrived, I brought the paints to the table along with the hot chocolate. I set them down next to the box of shells. "I saw these this morning," I said simply, "and they made me think of Lily." I didn't say any more about it. I sat with them for a while in silence, a different kind of silence than before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet, fragile possibility. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Julian was vibrating with a tension that was almost painful to watch. He wanted to tell Thomas to paint, to command him to engage. I gave him a small, warning shake of my head. This could not be forced. Then, with a slowness that was agonizing, Thomas's hand moved. It crept across the Formica tabletop like a shy crab, inch by inch. His fingers brushed against the plastic case of the paints. He didn't open it. He just rested his fingertips on it, as if testing its temperature, its reality. He stayed like that for the rest of the hour, his hand on the paint box, his gaze fixed on the shells. It was the first decision I had seen him make. The first bridge he had built, however small, from his island of silence to the world outside. The next day, he opened the paint box. He stared at the little circles of color for a long time. Then, he reached in and his finger touched the circle of blue. He didn't pick up a brush. He just rested his finger on the hard, dry pigment. Julian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than frustration or calculation in his eyes. It was a flicker of raw, desperate hope. And it was aimed at me. This slow, painstaking process continued for another week. Each day brought a tiny, incremental step. He picked up a brush. He dipped it in the water glass I had left for him. He touched the wet brush to the blue paint. And then, one rainy Friday morning, he picked up a large, white clamshell from Lily's box. And he began to paint. He painted the entire shell a deep, dark, watery blue. Then he picked up another and painted it gray. Then another, which he covered in black. He was painting his world. The fog, the storm, the darkness. It was a bleak and heartbreaking palette, but it was a language. He was finally telling his story, not with words, but with color. That afternoon, after Thomas had been picked up by the driver for his daily, silent walk, Julian stayed behind. He looked exhausted, but the hard, brittle edge was gone from his face. "I don't understand you, Edna," he said, his voice quiet, almost bewildered. "You come here every day, you talk, you wait." The therapists, they had programs, charts, scheduled activities. They tried to force a reaction. You do nothing. And yet, he trailed off, gesturing to the collection of dark, painted shells on the table. "I'm not doing nothing, Julian," I said gently, wiping down the counter. "I'm listening. That's all." His silence is saying more than you can imagine. It's screaming. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. He looked down at his hands, which were clasped on the table. They were manicured and powerful, the hands of a man who signed multi-million-dollar deals. But right then, they looked helpless. His mother, Isabel, we were on the boat. Our boat. It was a beautiful day, then a rogue wave. It came out of nowhere. It hit us broadside. Isabel, she was thrown against the mast. I was at the helm. Thomas was right there. He saw it all. His voice broke, the confession raw and jagged. I got him into the life raft. But I couldn't. I couldn't get to her in time. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, she was gone. And he hasn't spoken since. The story filled the small diner, heavier than any fog. The pieces clicked into place. The boat. The sea. The suddenness. It was my story, and it was his story, twisted into a different shape. The sea that had taken my Arthur had also, in its way, taken his Isabel and stolen his son's voice. He's not just mourning his mother, I said, my heart aching for this broken man and his broken boy. He's trapped in the moment it happened. And maybe he feels guilty. Children do. They think if they had done something different, been somewhere else, it wouldn't have happened. But what do I do? He pleaded, the billionaire disappearing completely, leaving only a grieving husband and a terrified father. How do I tell him it wasn't his fault? You don't tell him, I said, my gaze falling on the dark, painted shells. You let him tell you. The next morning, Thomas began painting a new shell. But this time, he didn't use blue or black or gray. He dipped his brush in the yellow. A bright, sunny, hopeful yellow. In the middle of a big, white shell, he painted a small, simple shape. A boat. A little yellow boat, all alone in a sea of white. It was the first glimmer of light in his dark, painted world, and I felt a profound, trembling hope rise in me. The little boat was still adrift, but for the first time, it was sailing under a sun. The day the silence finally broke, it began with a clamor. It was a Monday, and the diner was humming with the start of the week rush. A young waiter, new to the job, was carrying a large tray piled high with plates of breakfast. His foot caught on the leg of a chair, and he went down. The tray flew from his hands, and the plates, thick ceramic dinerware, hit the linoleum floor with a series of shockingly loud, explosive crashes. The entire diner fell silent. And in that silence, I heard a small, sharp gasp from the corner booth. I whipped my head around. Thomas had his hands clamped over his ears, his body rigid with terror. His carefully constructed wall of silence had been shattered by the sound. His eyes, which had started to show flickers of life, were now wide and dark with a primal fear I recognized instantly. He wasn't in the harbor light anymore. He was on a boat, in a storm, surrounded by the terrifying chaos of an accident. His father, Julian, started to rise, his face a mask of panic. "Thomas, it's okay. It's just some plates." But I was already moving. I rushed to the booth and knelt on the floor beside him, putting myself directly in his line of sight. I didn't try to touch him or pull his hands away from his ears. I just made him see me. "Thomas," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the low tide. "Thomas, look at me." It was a loud noise. It was just some broken plates. But it's over now. You're here. You're in the diner. You're with me, Edna. You are safe. I repeated it like a prayer, a mantra against the storm in his mind. You are safe. We are safe here. His eyes darted around frantically, seeing things that weren't there. He looked at the floor where the waiter was now scrambling to pick up the broken shards of ceramic. His breathing was coming in shallow, ragged pants. A tear, then another, escaped from his wide eyes and traced a path down his pale cheeks. His whole body was trembling. Then his lips, which had been a still, pale line for 6 agonizing months, trembled and parted. A sound emerged, a choked, rusty whisper, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. It was so quiet I almost missed it. "Loud," he breathed. The word was a stone dropped into a perfectly still lake. Loud. It was a word of pure memory, of pure terror. It was the sound of a wave crashing, the sound of a mast snapping, the sound of a world breaking apart. In the booth, Julian sank back against the vinyl, a choked sob escaping him. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. The other patrons in the diner, who had been watching the drama with concerned expressions, slowly turned back to their breakfasts, giving the family a bubble of privacy. I didn't look at Julian. My entire universe was this small, trembling boy. I gave him a small, watery smile, feeling my own tears welling up. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. It was very loud. It was a scary sound, wasn't it? I didn't tell him it was okay. I didn't dismiss his fear. I validated it. I stepped into it with him. He looked at me, his eyes still shimmering with panic, but a flicker of something else was there now, confusion, surprise. He had spoken his terror aloud, and the world hadn't ended. I hadn't shushed him. I had agreed with him. I gestured to the young waiter, who looked mortified. It was an accident. "See? He just dropped the plates. It happens." Thomas's gaze followed my finger. He looked at the broken plates, then back at me. His trembling began to subside, ever so slightly. He took a shaky breath. He had spoken. The seal was broken. That single word, loud, was the first loose stone in an avalanche of silence. It didn't happen all at once. The words that followed in the coming days were like shy creatures, peeking out of a burrow before daring to step into the light. They were mostly single words, whispered observations tied to his paintings. He would paint a shell with crashing blue and white waves and hold it up to me. "Loud water," he would whisper. I would nod. Yes, the water can be very loud in a storm. He painted another shell, this one with a tiny figure in the water. My heart clenched. "Cold," he whispered, his eyes on the painting. So cold. Each word was a confession, a piece of the story he had held locked inside him. And with each word, a little bit of the weight seemed to lift from his small shoulders. Julian, meanwhile, was undergoing his own transformation. He had stopped being an observer and had become a participant. He would sit there, his coffee growing cold, and just listen. He learned the art of patient silence, a skill his high-powered life had never required of him. The real breakthrough came a week later. Julian, taking a cue from my own storytelling, brought a small, silver-framed photo to the diner. It was a picture of a beautiful woman with a radiant smile and eyes the same shade of hazel as her son's. Isabel. He placed it on the table next to the box of shells. Thomas was painting, covering a shell in streaks of gray fog. When he saw the photograph, his hand stilled. He stared at his mother's smiling face, his own expression unreadable. Julian came and knelt on the floor, the same way I had. He didn't speak to Thomas at first. He just looked at the picture. "I miss your mom so much, buddy," he said, his voice thick and raw. "There isn't a minute of the day I don't think about her. It hurts." Tears began to stream down the face of the billionaire. Not quiet, controlled tears, but the messy, painful tears of a man utterly broken by grief. He made no effort to hide them. He was finally showing his son that he was hurting, too. Thomas looked from the photograph of his smiling mother to the face of his weeping father. He watched the tears for a long moment. Then, he reached out his small hand, not to the shells or the paints, but to his father's face. He gently touched one of his father's tears with his fingertip. He looked at the wetness on his finger, then back at his dad. "Dad," he whispered. And then Dad said. It was a sentence, a complete thought, an expression of empathy. He wasn't just trapped in his own fear anymore. He was seeing the pain in someone else. Julian let out a raw cry, a sound of such profound relief and love that it brought tears to my own eyes. He gathered his son into his arms, burying his face in the boy's hair. And this time, Thomas didn't stiffen or pull away. He hugged his father back, his small arms wrapping around Julian's neck, holding on as if he were an anchor in a storm. I turned away to polish a clean coffee pot, giving them the privacy of their reunion, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. The two of them, father and son, were finally in the same boat, navigating the same sea of grief together. The weeks that followed were like watching a sped-up film of a flower blooming. The whispers became spoken words. The words became sentences. The sentences became questions. Why do seagulls steal chips? Where does the fog go when the sun comes out? Was Mom's favorite color blue too? He was re-engaging with the world, his natural childhood curiosity fighting its way back to the surface. He and I developed our own special bond. He would show me his paintings, which were now filled with color, yellow suns, green trees, and bright red lobster boats. He painted a picture of me, a stick figure with a halo of white hair and a big smile, standing behind the counter of the diner. He pointed to it and said, "Clear as a bell, that's Edna. She makes good muffins." It was the highest compliment I had ever received. Julian and Thomas extended their stay in our little town. They rented a cottage on the edge of the bay, and our morning sessions at the Harbor Light became a cherished routine. The hard-edged tycoon from Toronto was gone, replaced by a man who knew the names of the local fishermen, who had learned to appreciate the slow rhythm of our town. He was just a dad, rediscovering his son. I would see them walking on the beach in the afternoons, Thomas running ahead to splash in the waves, his laughter carrying on the salty air. The sound was more beautiful than any birdsong. The day before they were scheduled to finally return to their life in the city, Julian asked me to stay after I'd closed the diner for the night. The sun was setting, casting a warm, honey-colored glow across the empty booths. "Edna," he began, his tone serious but gentle. "We need to talk about my offer." I immediately felt my back stiffen. "Julian, I told you. There is no debt. There is no payment." "I know," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "I know. What I offered that first day was crass. It was the desperate act of a man who thought money was the only tool he had. You taught me how wrong I was. You taught me about patience and grace and the kind of value that can't be listed on a stock exchange." He slid a heavy leather-bound folder across the counter towards me. I eyed it with suspicion. "This isn't a check, Edna," he said, reading my expression. "This is an idea. A partnership." Hesitantly, I opened the folder. Inside were official-looking documents, blueprints, and charters. My eyes widened as I began to understand. He had bought the building. The entire Harbor Light property, from the diner on the ground floor to the 2 floors of dusty and used apartments above it. "Julian, you can't. Please, just hear me out," he said, his voice earnest. "You saved my son. You may have saved me too. I can never repay that, but I can honor it. This diner, it's where the light came back on for Thomas. It's a special place. I want to partner with you to make it a beacon for others." He spread the blueprints out on the counter. "We'll renovate the whole building. A brand new kitchen and dining room for the Harbor Light downstairs. And you won't be a waitress anymore. You'll be the managing partner with a proper salary and a share of the profits." My head was spinning. "A partner? Julian, I'm a waitress." "You're the heart of this place," he countered. "But that's only the first part." He tapped the plans for the upstairs floors. "The rest of the profits will go to this. He pushed another document towards me. It was the incorporation papers for a new nonprofit, the Isabel Croft Center for Art and Healing. The 2 floors above the diner will be converted into a center for children who have experienced trauma, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. A place where they can come, free of charge, and find their voice again, through art, through storytelling, through painting shells. It will be funded by my family's foundation, but its home will be here. It will be Isabel's legacy. And it will be run by the one person on Earth I trust to do it right. He looked me directly in the eye. You, Edna. I sank onto a nearby stool, my legs suddenly weak. It was too much to take in. He wasn't just giving me a gift. He was giving me a purpose, a mission that was born from the quiet miracle that had unfolded in my humble diner. It was a way to take the small, private healing of one boy and amplify it, sending its ripples out into the world. It was a way to give meaning not just to Isabel's death, but to my long years of quiet grief for Arthur. The love I had poured into my own lost family could now nourish so many others. I don't have the words, I whispered, staring at the plans, at the name of his late wife, at the future taking shape on my countertop. You don't need words, Edna, he said, his voice gentle. Just say yes. Be my partner. Help me turn this pain into something beautiful. Tears streamed down my face, but for the first time in 20 years, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming, impossible joy. Yes, I said, my voice a choked whisper. Yes, Julian. I will. They left the next morning. Thomas hugged me so tightly I could feel his little heart beating against mine. I'll paint a picture of my house for you, Edna, he promised, his voice bright and clear. It has a big garden. I would love to see it, sweetheart, I told him, smoothing down his hair. I stood on the wharf and watched the black car disappear, not into the fog this time, but into the bright morning sun. The world around me was the same. The fishermen were mending their nets, the gulls were wheeling overhead, and in the distance, I could just hear the foghorn, its work done for the day. But I was a different woman. My life was no longer a quiet epilogue. It was a brand new book, and I was holding the pen. The harbor light was reborn, brighter and stronger, and above it, the Isabel Croft Center became a place of quiet miracles, a haven filled with the scent of paint and the sound of children learning to tell their stories. I still wear my apron and pour coffee for the regulars. It keeps me grounded. But now my heart is full. The ache for Arthur is still there, a soft, familiar shadow, but it's no longer a hollow space. It's a source of strength. The sea took my husband, and for so long, I thought it had drowned my life along with him. But the sea also brought a desperate father and a silent boy to my shore. It took from me, yes, but just as Arthur used to tell Lily, it gave back in ways I could never have imagined. It gave me back my purpose. It taught me that a heart can be broken and still have more love to give. And it showed me that sometimes the most profound conversations begin with just being quiet enough to listen. That quiet, whispered yes hung in the air of the empty diner, feeling more solid and real than anything I had said in 20 years. It was a promise to Julian, a promise to the memory of his wife, and, in a way I was only just beginning to understand, it was a promise to myself. A promise that the end of one story does not have to be the end of everything. The months that followed were a whirlwind of controlled chaos, a stark contrast to the slow, predictable rhythm my life had known. The harbor light, my steadfast sanctuary for 2 decades, closed its doors to the public for the first time I could remember. A large, polite crew of construction workers descended on Lunenburg, their trucks and equipment looking almost as out of place as Julian's black car had. The town was buzzing with rumors. Old man Hemlock, who'd been drinking coffee in the same booth since the 1970s, cornered me by the post office. "Heard you won the lottery, Edna," he'd said, a twinkle in his eye. I just smiled. Something like that, George. Something even better. Julian was true to his word. This was a partnership. Every week, architectural plans and material samples would arrive by courier. He would call me, his voice no longer that of a commanding CEO, but of an excited collaborator. "Edna, what do you think of this wood for the countertops? Is it too dark? We want it to feel warm, like your muffins." What about the color for the booths? I was thinking a deep ocean blue, but you know the light in there better than anyone. Edna Robinson, who had spent my life taking orders, was now making decisions that shaped the future. He listened to my every suggestion, valuing my practical knowledge of the space and the town over the slick opinions of his expensive designers. I insisted the big window in the corner booth remain, and that we keep the old ship's wheel that had hung over the door for 50 years. These were the things that held the diner's soul, and he understood. Slowly, impossibly, a new building began to emerge from the shell of the old one. The diner downstairs was transformed. It was bright and clean, with a gleaming new kitchen and sturdy, comfortable booths. But it was still the harbor light. The scent of fresh wood and paint mingled with the lingering ghost of frying bacon and salt air. It was my old friend, just wearing a beautiful new coat. But the real miracle was happening upstairs. The 2 floors that had been nothing but dusty, forgotten storage rooms for half a century were gutted and rebuilt into something full of light and hope. Walls were knocked down to create large, airy studios with huge windows overlooking the harbor. One room was filled with easels and paints, another with tables for working with clay and driftwood. There was a quiet room, filled with soft chairs and bookshelves, a place for reading or just for being silent in a way that felt safe, not scary. When I walked through it for the first time, the floors still smelling of fresh varnish, I could almost hear the future sounds that would fill it, the excited chatter of children, the quiet scratch of a pencil on paper, the soft hum of healing. The grand reopening was on a perfect day in early summer, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The entire town, it seemed, turned out. Julian and Thomas flew in for the occasion. Thomas, now a confident 9-year-old, was a different boy entirely. The haunted, vacant look in his eyes was gone forever, replaced by a bright, intelligent curiosity. He ran around the new diner, pointing things out to the fishermen, his voice clear and happy. Julian stood beside me as we prepared to cut a ceremonial ribbon stretched across the new front door. He was wearing a suit, but he looked more relaxed and at ease than I had ever seen him. "It's beautiful, Edna," he said, his voice quiet amidst the crowd. "It's more than I ever imagined." "It's a place with a good heart," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. He had asked me to say a few words, and I was terrified. But as I looked out at the faces of my friends and neighbors, and then at Julian, and finally at Thomas, who gave me a huge, gap-toothed grin, the fear melted away. I didn't talk about business or renovations. I talked about how the harbor light had always been a place where people came to find shelter from a storm, literal or otherwise. And how, thanks to the vision of a grieving father and the memory of a wonderful woman, it would now be a beacon of hope for children who were lost in their own private storms. Then, to everyone's surprise, Julian gently coaxed Thomas to the front. The boy, holding his father's hand, looked at the small crowd. "My mom, Isabel, would have loved this place," he said, his small voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent air. "And Edna makes the best muffins in the whole world." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, and I felt tears of pure joy run down my cheeks. My life found a new rhythm, one that was busier but infinitely more fulfilling. I was up before the foghorn, as always, but my days were no longer a simple, repeating loop. I would spend the mornings downstairs in the diner, which was more popular than ever. I still put on my apron, poured the coffee, and made sure the blueberry grunt was just right. Talking with the regulars, hearing their stories, it kept me grounded. It reminded me of who I was. But in the afternoons, I would hand the reins over to my new manager, a wonderful young woman from the town, and I would go upstairs. The Isabel Croft Center opened its doors a month after the diner, and from the beginning, it was a quiet, sacred space. We hired 2 wonderful, certified art therapists, and children from all over the province began to come. They were quiet children, children with shadows in their eyes that I recognized. Children who had seen too much or lost too much. I wasn't a therapist. My role was simpler. I was the keeper of the space. I was the one who made sure there were always fresh flowers on the tables. I was the one who baked cookies, filling the halls with a warm, comforting scent. And sometimes I would just sit with a child who didn't want to talk or paint, just like I had sat with Thomas. I would bring out Lily's old box of shells, which now had a permanent home in the quiet room, and I would tell them stories of the sea. I learned that listening is its own form of therapy, that a steady, patient presence can be the most powerful medicine of all. One afternoon, I sat with a little girl who had recently lost her father. She wouldn't speak to anyone, and she would only draw with a black crayon, covering pages and pages in dark, angry scribbles. I didn't say much. I just sat beside her, and after a while, I started painting a clamshell, just as I had with Thomas. I painted it a bright, sunny yellow. I didn't offer it to her, but I left it on the table when I was done. The next day, when I came in, I saw that she had taken a blue crayon and drawn a tiny, hesitant boat floating on a sea next to my yellow sun. It was a beginning. A new conversation. The miracle was happening again. Julian and Thomas became a regular part of our Lunenburg life. They would fly in for long weekends, and they bought the cottage they had once rented, making it their second home. The visits weren't formal anymore. They were family. Julian would come into the diner kitchen and clumsily try to learn my muffin recipe, getting flour all over his expensive jeans. Thomas, now a lanky preteen, would spend hours on the wharf with the fishermen, learning to tie knots and listening to their exaggerated tales. He was fascinated by the stories of my Arthur, and he would ask me endless questions about his boat and the fish he caught. One evening, Julian and I were sitting on the deck of the center, watching the fishing boats return to the harbor as the sun went down. "You know, Edna," he said, staring out at the water, "for the longest time after Isabel died, I hated the sea. I saw it as a thief, a monster that had stolen my life from me. But being here, watching what you do, watching Thomas heal, I'm starting to see it differently. The sea has two faces," I said quietly. "It can be cruel, and it can take what we love most. But it also gives life. It provides for this whole town. And it brought you here. It brought you to me. It's a force of nature, Julian. It's not good or bad. It just is. The question is what we do with what it leaves in its wake." He was quiet for a long time, watching the lights twinkle on across the harbor. "You saved him, Edna," he finally said, his voice husky. "You gave me my son back." "No, Julian," I replied, placing my old, weathered hand on his. "We saved each other. All of us. Now, as I stand here in my 68th year, my life feels impossibly full. My daughter Lily visits more often, bringing my grandchildren, who love the art center and their Auntie Edna's endless supply of cookies. The diner is thriving, a warm, beating heart in the center of town. And upstairs, children are quietly finding their way back to the light, one painted shell, one whispered word at a time. It is a legacy I never dreamed of, a purpose I never knew I was looking for. Sometimes, in the very early morning, I still wake to the sound of the foghorn. For 20 years, it was a voice of profound loneliness, a mournful echo of the empty space beside me. But its song has changed. I no longer hear sorrow in its deep, resonant call. I hear a greeting. A steady, reassuring presence calling out in the darkness, a reminder that even when we can't see the way forward, something is there, keeping watch, guiding us home. My Arthur is gone. The ache of his absence is a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I am, like a silver thread. But it is no longer a source of pain. It is a source of empathy. It is the well from which I draw the patience and understanding that I now offer to these children. His memory is not a ghost that haunts me. It is a gentle hand on my shoulder, guiding me still. The tide of life is a powerful, unpredictable thing. It pulls away the people we love, leaving our shores barren and empty. For so long, I thought my tide had gone out for good. But I was wrong. It came back in, carrying a broken man and a silent boy, and with them, a new and extraordinary purpose. It taught me that a life is not over when it becomes quiet. It taught me that a heart can be shattered and still have an infinite capacity to love. And it showed me that sometimes, the greatest treasures are not the ones we plan for, but the ones that wash up on our shores when we least expect them. My story was not finished. It was just waiting for the fog to lift.